Go ahead and get started. My name is Karen Smith. I'm a breast cancer medical oncologist with Johns Hopkins, and I'd like to welcome you to one of the presentations that's part of our Survive and Thrive 2021 Lunch and Learn series. Here we go. So our Lunch and Learn series is co-directed by myself and Dr. Vered Stearns, who is the head of the Johns Hopkins Women's Malignancies Disease Group program. And we have an extensive planning committee with input from patient advocates and navigators as we've put together this exciting series for you. The title of today's talk is Enhancing Quality of Life During and After Breast Cancer Treatment. We'll be hearing from Dr. Miriam Lusberg from Yale. Miriam is an associate professor of medicine at the Yale School of Medicine and director of the Yale Breast Center and chief of breast cancer and medical oncology there. We will also be hearing from Natalie Epps, who's going to be sharing her patient experience as a young breast cancer patient diagnosed several years ago, who's been giving back as a fierce advocate for survivorship ever since. And the session will be moderated by myself and Samantha Horn, who is also a young breast cancer survivor diagnosed initially at the age of 26, who has been actively involved with patient advocacy efforts ever since then. A brief overview of the next hour. We're going to hear a 30-minute presentation by Dr. Lusberg. That will be followed by about a 5-minute presentation from Natalie Epps about her experience. We're going to pause then and just do a brief live feedback survey. It's really important to us to hear your feedback about whether or not the session is useful. And we're going to try for the first time to do that right in the middle of the session to see how that goes. And then the most important part of our session is going to be a live Q&A. We're going to go back and forth. You may enter questions into the chat box or use the Q&A function, and we will be reviewing them and selecting submitted questions for discussion amongst the group. Once the webinar has completed, you will receive immediately a request to complete a more formal evaluation. It takes less than 5 minutes, and we really use your responses to guide our future activities. No personal information will be collected. If you're unable to complete it immediately after the webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email, and we're hoping that you could please do it within the next 7 days to help us with our future program. And now we'll move on to Dr. Lusberg's presentation. I'm going to unshare.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm so happy to be here with you, and I'm so impressed with the program setup, which includes active engagement with patients and advocates, which is exactly how it should be. It's not about just me talking to you about quality of life, and I really enjoy the conversation that we're going to have. So quality of life during and after breast cancer treatment. My disclosures are listed here and are not relevant to any of the topics that I will be speaking about. So it's a big topic, obviously. And so broadly, the agenda is, what is quality of life? What does it mean? Then I'll focus on 3 gaps in knowledge and talk about some future directions. And as I mentioned, the best part of the session will be your questions and your comments and hearing from our patient advocates on the panel. So what is quality of life? I think no matter how many definitions I give you, what's most important is what it means to you. You don't need the scientific and the social science definition of quality of life. I think all of us have a sense of what is important to us in our life, what values, what we hold dear. Broadly, it's a multidimensional concept that includes both positive and negative aspects of life that go well beyond health. In scientific literature, we do formally define health-related quality of life as an individual or group's perceived physical and mental health over time. But the definitions are not so important. All of you yourselves are experts in what quality of life means to you. And so, you know, part of what I'll be focusing on is how breast cancer has broadly changed over time and how personalizing our breast cancer treatments impacts quality of life. And are we doing better? That's a question that I would love to hear from you guys about. So this is familiar to many of you. Many men and women are diagnosed with breast cancer each year. They may go through a series of treatments that includes preoperative treatment, surgery, some type of adjuvant therapy. And here's one of our biggest gaps. We still have distant recurrences, and we have over 40,000 individuals still dying from breast cancer. And in this whole schema, I think that how quality of life is impacted is both by the type of treatments that we choose, how we partner together as clinicians and patients, and then how are we doing in terms of managing toxicities that both occur acutely as well as down the road. And equally important is how are we involving you as patients as key stakeholders every step of the way. And the big overarching theme of the talk is that quality of life is not just one bucket. All of these factors influence it, and that's part of what makes it complicated, is that a lot of things are feeding into it. So moving on to gaps in knowledge. There are many, many gaps. For this purposes of this talk, I've chosen to focus on 3 gaps. Gap number 1 is, are we choosing the right treatments at the right time, at the right dose? Since these directly impact the whole experience of receiving cancer care. Gap 2 is toxicity management. Are we better able to identify who's at risk for different toxicities, and are we able to mitigate these toxicities? And a lot of work still to be done in this space. And gap number 3 is intricately linked to gap 1 and 2, which is how we communicate. How are we functioning as one team? Patients, advocates, clinicians, the whole healthcare enterprise. How are we doing with shared decision making? Are we addressing disparities and inequities and racism within our system? And do our patients have access to specialty services that they need to really have the care that they need? I have precision medicine and personalized medicine here at the bottom, and we tend to think about these sometimes as only pertaining to treatments of chemo or immunotherapy, but really personalized medicine and precision medicine is so much broader than that and touches on all aspects of care, including a holistic look at how we manage symptoms and symptom management and quality of life. And as clinicians, how do we communicate and understand these toxicities and actually engage in our patients? All of these directly impact quality of life. So I saw this picture a while ago. I borrowed it from my colleague, Steve Sanas in Dana-Farber. And I really think I use it often in my talks. And I think it really captures what our patients, what you are facing, which is that it's not always an even playing field, that as we deal with these gaps, our hope is that we can even the playing field so everybody has a fair chance. So this is the theme that you'll see emphasized throughout the talk. So starting with gap number 1, which is how are we picking our treatments? This is a little history lesson in precision cancer medicine where, you know, in the 1970s, late 1970s, the estrogen receptor pathway was actually identified. And then we knew how to target it with tamoxifen. So one of the most amazing advances in breast cancer care. And we went through, we have identified obviously a series of anti-estrogen therapies that are imperfect in terms of toxicities and efficacies, but certainly they were an improvement to what we had before. And then the HER2 positive story, Julia Maas, one of the advocates who leads the GRASP movement, posted a very touching tribute to the anniversary of Herceptin being approved in the US over 20 years ago, and how it has dramatically changed the course of care for many patients. And so with these precision, essentially breast cancer was one of the first cancers where we could actually say that we had precision breast medicine. And we've come a long way from those early days of ER positive and HER2 positive stories that I just showed. And it's become more intricate. So now we have additional markers that we look at. We are able to better subtype our breast cancers, and we have identified a number of different genetic and genomic alterations where we have targeted drugs for, which is exciting. And why am I even talking about this in a quality of life talk? Well, often a lot of these drugs, because they're able to target the breast cancer more effectively, have allowed us to use less chemotherapy over time and be more precise in terms of how we deliver our care, which is important. For example, for patients with BRCA alterations, we have clear data that using targeted therapies such as PARP inhibitors actually won out against a traditional chemotherapy. So obviously exciting. This is part of that picture of, if we can be more precise about our treatments, we can potentially improve quality of life. Here's another study of really using circulating tumor DNA or liquid biopsy to directly address residual disease and high-risk triple-negative breast cancer, and can we again be more precise beyond the more traditional chemotherapies that are currently the standard of care. So certainly we have many more targeted therapies than before, and they have definitely, without doubt, decreased some of our toxicity profiles and improved outcomes and quality of life. Yet these treatments still have significant toxicities. And I believe one of the myths is that we may not, either as patients or clinician or all of the above, we may not recognize this always as readily and underappreciate what chronic exposure to these drugs look like. For example, Oncotype DX, which many of you are familiar with, allows us to select the patients that could be spared chemotherapy in estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, and this has led to significant reductions in chemotherapy. However, what we have done instead is we have a lot of patients who are struggling with endocrine therapy side effects. So yes, we spare them the toxicity of chemotherapy, but we also need to focus on the toxicities of endocrine therapy, which I will touch on in a few upcoming slides. And for this chapter of the talk, I also wanted to kind of touch on conversations that are currently ongoing among advocacy circles, and also in direct discussions with the FDA about how we dose our drugs, how we dose our targeted therapies. And this brings me to a patient-led movement led by Ann Loester, who you can see pictured here. This patient-centered dosing initiative is something that I'm so proud to be involved in. And this conversation has taken place in the last several years, and she led this discussion within the last ASCO. And we also have an upcoming presentation in San Antonio coming up. So the study rationale behind the patient dosing initiative is that we don't often make distinction between dosing of drugs in metastatic breast cancer versus early stage. And the typical starting doses of drugs are typically based on phase 1 dose escalation trials, often known as the maximum tolerated dose. And this may be fine in a clinical trial setting where you have a very kind of narrow population, whereas in the real world, patient responses and tolerability may vary, which can impact quality of life. So what this board and this advocacy-led effort have really challenged is our existing paradigm, that higher dose of drugs, higher dose of toxicity necessarily always leads to better efficacy, versus a new paradigm where let's try to think about ways that we can personalize our starting dose in clinical practice based on our patient goals and patient attributes. So I'll show you a few of the slides from this important ASCO presentation that does relate to our conversation today about quality of life. So as you can see, majority of patients, 86%, have actually had toxicities related to their treatment for breast cancer in the metastatic setting. 20% have had an ER visit or hospitalization, and close to half, almost half, have actually had to miss treatments due to toxicity. So I know this audience understands the importance of side effects and toxicity management, but for those who may be less important and who may not realize the importance, and I know it's not you guys, but I think this question really hits the mark, which is, yes, we can be focused on treatment all we want, but if we're not managing side effects and quality of life, it can actually lead to the interruption of the same treatment that we're trying to push toward. And many of the patients who were generous in their time to participate in the survey actually were on targeted therapies and endocrine therapy. So again, highlighting that just because a drug is a targeted therapy does not necessarily make it less toxic. And here you can see the range of side effects that were experienced by these large group of patients. And this includes fatigue and nausea. You can see a lot of neuropathy, pain issues, cognitive issues. And what the scope of this talk cannot allow is for me to touch on every toxicity, but I'm definitely open to your questions as we further converse. So how were these side effects mitigated? And one of the principal ways was by lowering the dose, using supportive care medications, and in some cases, using different specialties and changing treatment. And so this was a very important presentation by really putting the question of dosing on the national scene and really talking about how important it was for patients and clinicians to really have a conversations about dosing, goals of care, and that we really needed to have better conversations about this area. And this work is continuing, and Anne Loser has continued to meet with the FDA, and there is a working group that will be forming to further look at this question. So kind of talking about a summary of our gap one is that breast cancer precision therapy is not new. We're one of the oldest cancers to benefit from precision therapy, and we're continuing to evolve through dedicated clinical trials in terms of better understanding of these targetable pathways, and this will only get better with research. However, the takeaway point that many of you have experienced yourselves is that targeted therapies are not necessarily without toxicities, and we really need to understand these toxicities, have better dialogues about how to manage them, and the only way this can happen is through close partnerships among healthcare workers as well as patients. Moving on to gap two, which is toxicity management. I like this schema drawn by a patient advocate, which I think describes very poignantly all the different ways that the treatment toxicities can be experienced from head to toe, and how it can be overwhelming some days to have so many different symptoms in one body and not always knowing who to turn to, who's going to manage what. And these are certainly things that I can't fully imagine, not being a patient myself, going through a cancer treatment, but in talking to my patients over a decade and a half, I've gotten the sense of how some days can be definitely harder than others. And kind of building on the theme again of targeted therapies, certainly we've been fortunate enough to have a number of new targeted therapies However, each of them has had additional unusual side effects that we may not have immediately maybe been aware of in the clinical trials. The perception that the new drugs do not have toxicity is clearly false. And it's always a balancing act. Treatments certainly do cause side effects, and the benefit is that the new treatments, as our treatments evolve, they may improve the disease burden. In patients with early stage breast cancer, they may reduce the risk that the breast cancer will come back. But we always have to balance that against short-term toxicities, long-term toxicities, and we're beginning to think about financial burden as a toxicity itself. The reason I plucked it out as a separate bullet was to make sure I mentioned it. But really, these are all toxicities and adverse events of our cancer treatments, and we need to be openly dialoguing about them. So one paper that I wanted to highlight was also another patient-led effort organized by one of the leaders of the BCSM chat that many of you participate in. Dr. Deanna Atai is a breast surgeon in UCLA, and she, through her social media connections and active engagement with patients, she actually led the largest real-world survey of endocrine therapy side effects experienced by patients. And over 2,400 men and women participated. As you can see, one of our other gaps in breast cancer research has been that there have been silos in terms of patients with metastatic disease and early stage breast cancer. And even though this was still a limited representation of those currently living with metastatic breast cancer, they were included, and they were also, their experiences, of course, as they should be, were counted in this survey. And as you can see, lots and lots of side effects. So pretty much close to over 90% of individuals had some type of side effects on endocrine therapy. And by endocrine therapy, I mean drugs like tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors. Some of you may be on Arimidex or anastrozole, letrozole or Femara, exemestane or aromasin. So I'm mentioning the names in case that's how you identify with them. And you can see, you know, large numbers of cognitive and mood issues, general physical changes, some GI and genitourinary symptoms, sexual side effects, vasomotor, by that we mean hot flashes, and the high cost of medication is also listed by some patients who answered the survey. Unfortunately, beyond the scope of the time for me to go over each of them, but I will focus on the musculoskeletal symptoms just to give you a story of how we're beginning to think about these and what studies have shown on them. Before I do that, I do want to highlight one of the findings, which was close to a half of participants actually did not note any relief from our current side effect management strategies. So again, highlighting the gaps, that there is a lot we need to do in terms of improving our toxicity management. And stunningly, but not stunningly, a third of participants were made to feel that they should be better able to handle these side effects, or that the side effects were not related to treatment. So I'll be interested to hear if some of you have had these experiences, and I'm very sorry if you've had them. So kind of focusing on the most commonly reported muscle and joint pain and stiffness, this is very common. A lot of patients say that I feel old, that when I wake up in the morning, things feel so much stiffer and it takes time to loosen up. And so there have been a few studies looking at different interventions for this, including exercise. And this sounds paradoxical, like how can you go exercise when you're hurting? And so we try to have these conversations with patients, but a little bit of movement has been shown to definitely improve the symptoms. lots of barriers, though, that we can talk about in the chat. Acupuncture was a large study led by Don Hirschman and team, where they took patients who were symptomatic from endocrine therapy, aromatase inhibitor, and having some type of joint pain, and they were randomized to weightless control, true acupuncture, or sham acupuncture. And as you can see, those with who received true acupuncture, almost 60% of them had a 2-point drop in pain. So this is obviously great, but it also highlights that if your pain score is an 8 and you drop it to a 6, is that clinically meaningful for that patient or not? So it's not a perfect intervention, but certainly was a positive study. However, lots of implementation issues in terms of insurance coverage, cost, and access. So how can we do better? So in addition to precision medicine, I like to think about precision symptom management with patient experience at the center, where we really think about mechanisms of these toxicities and try to really understand the interplay between the tumor, the host, and how can we do things better. So there has been a lot of work on predictors of toxicity. Can we pluck out the patients who are more likely to suffer from different toxicities and focus interventions on them? Dr. Stern is doing amazing work in this space, as well as others. But the idea of looking at our genes, not just in our tumors, but our own genetic makeup, to understand what genetic factors influence things. So back to the acupuncture story, for example, can we figure out those patients who are more likely to benefit from acupuncture so that we're sparing the patients from the added cost and time of doing that? So is this ready for prime time? No, but this is how we're beginning to think about things, is can we identify those most at risk and then focus on them? And so lots of work being done in this area, including by my group, in terms of using machine learning algorithms to really identify who's most at risk for aromatase inhibitor arthralgias. And for the interest of time, I'm going to move on from that. And really the theme that I would like to take away from is that we need to better understand what is the basis of our toxicity, what's leading, what is exactly happening in the joints when these toxicities are happening. And if we can understand that, we can better address them. That's the hope. So summarizing GAP2, we need to do better. So lots of exciting work going on in terms of both preventive as well as therapeutic strategies for common cancer toxicities. Many of them are not ready for prime time, but we are working on it. And I hope in the next 5 to 10 years, we can essentially identify patients most at risk for certain toxicities and actually do intervention studies in that population instead of all comers. Moving on to the most important part, which is GAP3, and I'm going to rush through it for the sake of time. I'm going to stop in the next 5 minutes so we have time for the other speakers. So patient voices and patient-reported outcomes is a key measure. If you look at a lot of our old studies from 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the toxicities were actually reported by clinicians asking patients what their symptoms were. And countless studies have shown how imperfect this is, that we clinicians really are not very good at doing this, and it typically leads to underreporting of significant symptoms. Whereas if we ask you what your symptoms are through these validated patient-reported outcomes, understanding your symptoms, your functional issues, satisfaction with care, whether the treatment is meaningful to you, was it worth it to you to undergo a certain treatment? All of these things are in the space of patient-reported outcomes. And right now, they're primarily in many centers, they're in clinical trial setting, although multiple initiatives are looking at integrating them seamlessly within routine clinical care. Not fully there in most centers, but getting there. I touched on real world data in terms of even the patient survey on endocrine therapy. I just want to highlight a limited snapshot in time. But as we begin to use these drugs more and more, and as patients stay on these drugs longer, there could be additional toxicities that we were not aware of. So understanding the experience of patients outside of clinical trials is super important. And one slide is not enough for this, but I think we need to be better partners. We need patients at the table from the beginning, at the onset of the concept design of a lot of these trials. I think it may be happening a little bit more in the therapeutic space. It needs to be happening just as much in the symptom intervention space. So this is something that I feel very passionate about, and I think the needle is beginning to move, again, because of the voices and the advocacy of many of you. And in terms of disparities, this is again a talk of it on its own. Many of you are familiar with the disparities that we know in treatment outcomes in the therapeutic space in terms of referrals to clinical trials. Unfortunately, the same disparities are also being seen in terms of supportive care measures and quality of life measures. So this one study that was published a few years ago actually showed that Black women with metastatic breast cancer actually had less prescription use of supportive care meds. They had more ICU stays and more hospitalizations, likely due to under treatment of their symptoms. So lots of work to be done in this space. And access. It can be very confusing as a patient. And right now, I think in many centers, it's on you to kind of try to figure out how to advocate for yourself and how to navigate a very complex healthcare system. And this is an area that I think is part of care coordination and implementation science that we're actively working on, which is you have certainly your oncology team, but we're not experts in everything. And it's so important to have primary care who's familiar with oncology issues and also have access to other specialties such as palliative medicine, symptom management experts, cardio-oncology. So how we talk as a bigger team and how we communicate our findings to our patients and again kind of have that team approach is something that I think is critical for quality of life and it's still a work in progress. So precision quality of life is impacted by so many factors. We certainly have more targeted therapeutics, but they can still impact quality of life. Inequities and social determinants of health are absolutely part of this picture. And we really need whole system thinking and things are not perfect but progress is ongoing. And I think with all of us having these dialogues, my hope is that we'll work together to improve patient outcomes, patient experience, and ultimately ensure better quality of life. So back to my picture, it's not an even playing field due to all these gaps. And my hope is that as we work together to address these gaps, we can even the playing field for every single patient out there. This is part of my life's work, and I really do look forward to partnering with all of you to work towards solutions. And to wrap it up, one size does not fit all. Some of the things I've said today may not resonate with you at all. I want to hear from you. There are toxicities that I didn't touch on due to time effects. But really, the bottom line is, let's talk about your experiences, let's talk about your treatments, and let's try to individually tailor things as much as possible. And I'll stop there so other experts can have a chance to speak as well. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Lustberg. I'm going to turn things over now to my co-moderator, Sam, who's going to introduce Natalie Epps, who's going to give us a little bit about the patient perspective that Dr. Lustberg was referring to.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you on the West Coast. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Natalie Epps. She is a 39-year-old survivor of 7 years. She is the mother of 2, Amaya and Aaliyah, and was pregnant with her second daughter when she was diagnosed with stage 2/3 breast cancer in 2014. Since then, Natalie has been an advocate for survivorship, speaking at different events and making herself available to support women on an individual basis who struggle with their diagnosis. She is an adamant proponent of self-exams, which is how she detected her disease. Since 2017, Natalie has served on 2 advisory boards at the Hopkins for CDC grants. And she is, in her free time, she is a 2007 graduate of Howard University School of Law and is a staff attorney for the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I want to first say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today about my experience. I hope that the information that I bring or share may be impactful for someone. I also will extend, as I always do, an opportunity to speak with anyone offline after today's meeting. I'm happy to have my contact information shared with any person who might have a desire to chat with me further, either about my own experience or just as a additional ear of support in your journey. So as Samantha mentioned, I'm 39 currently. 7 years ago in 2014, I was 31. So first, there is the myth buster that young women can and do get breast cancer. I was 31. I was pregnant with my second daughter, and I had a toddler at the time, a 2-year-old who turned 3 in the time period that I learned about having breast cancer. The first thing that I would just highlight about my journey and how I detected breast cancer is that I felt a puffiness in my armpit initially. And I saw a GYN doctor who was not my main doctor. It was another doctor in the practice, and I mentioned it, and the conversation went kind of like this. Something's going on in my arm. I'm not that worried about it. You're pregnant. There are lots of changes that happen in the breast. You're okay. You're young. You'll be fine. So a few months go by, actually, where I sort of disregard my own instincts and take the advice of the doctor at that time until I feel a lump in my breast. And so at that time, when I finally saw my main physician, I mentioned the puffiness that I felt as well as the lump in my breast. And her words exactly were, "You know your body better than anyone else, so let's get it checked out." So of course, I went through the normal course of having a biopsy. It turned out to be breast cancer. So my main takeaway is make sure that you're being your own advocate and being truthful in all conversations with your doctors along the way about symptoms, about how you're feeling, your mental health. All of those things are important for the quality of life you need to both get through your treatment and to thrive after. So I had all of the sort of traditional aspects of treatment. I started with chemotherapy. I had a mastectomy on my left breast and lymph node removal. I experienced radiation. And then after having an expander for quite a while, which I hated, just to be honest with you, I ended up getting reconstruction. I chose to do saline implants because of my fear of rupture from other alternatives. And then I did 5 years of anti-estrogen hormone therapy because I was an estrogen receptive positive breast cancer. That was difficult. Obviously, 5 years of injections. Apparently, when you are young, you may need a little bit more medication. So I went from getting 1 shot a month to 2 shots a month. They were painful, obviously, but necessary, and I don't have any regrets of the treatment path that I took. But to speak on the things that I have done during treatment, as well as what I do now to sort of maintain my quality of life, the main thing that I focused on during treatment and still that I focus on is my diet. I learned, excuse me, I learned pretty early on the importance of diet, both to making me strong through treatment, as well as just repairing my body from the damage that was being done to it from the different medications. I did a lot of research on vegetables that I didn't eat. I'm now a fan of so many that I didn't love before. And so I did take on a love for educating myself more about improving my diet and my health internally, separate from the course of treatment that was being recommended to me. That included exercise. I still struggle with that. I do go bike riding with my husband when I can. I have 2 kids, as I mentioned, they're now 10 and 7. And so it is very difficult to find time to add exercise to my life. But I do find it to be a very important component, particularly because I do still suffer from some physical side effects of the treatment. For example, the radiation and, in my opinion, the mastectomy has created a very tight feeling in my upper body. So my left arm, even though I have a good range of motion, I still wake up in a lot of pain. And so sometimes exercise has been very helpful in trying to sort through those issues, as well as getting massages. So treat yourself to a massage. It can be both restful as well as therapeutic for helping you through some of the physical challenges that come along with the treatment. The other thing that I'm still working on is learning to rest. I think that that is a very important component. I think we live in a society that pushes us to work and overwork ourselves in our daily lives. We do all we can as moms for our families, but learning to rest is a constant struggle, but is a necessary step in the process of healing, as well as just getting your mental health where it needs to be to sort of navigate some of these stresses that life gives us. I also will say, when I say be truthful to your doctors, like tell them everything. I do owe my change in career path. I've been an attorney for 14 years. I started out as a trial attorney, and I did really, really heavy cases representing people charged with really serious felonies in the District of Columbia. I now represent people on parole, and so my workload is a lot lighter, and I owe that actually to my oncologist, because I constantly made sure that he was aware of the stress that my job was bringing me, and he was helpful in helping me realize that I needed a change because stress is also unhealthy. Some things I would recommend as we journey this path that we're on is to maintain a healthy diet. Like I mentioned, one of the things that I also pride myself in is building relationships with other people in the breast cancer community. And so I do suggest that folks find some sort of support, whether it's family or another survivor or person going through the journey. Sometimes just having a listening ear can be helpful. Some things that were helpful for me, like I said, was support from my family. And I would just encourage everyone to seek out at least one person that they could get some support from through this process. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have. I don't want to take up time beyond my limits, but if you do want to speak to me offline, I am very willing and able to provide my contact information, my email address, whatever means would be best suitable to reach out to me for whatever your needs are on your journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's just, you're amazing is all I can say. We would like to just take a brief break to get a little bit of feedback from you. And then for our last 15 minutes or so, we really are hoping to engage in a dialogue and discuss some of the things that each of you has brought up, Dr. Lusberg and Natalie, and then answer any questions that you have. This brief feedback survey should just take a couple of minutes, no more. And I'm going to start, we're going to see a comprehensive evaluation afterwards that also is still only a few minutes. So you'll have another opportunity to give us some feedback. Sam, do you want to go ahead and start our discussion?
Sure. I think actually both Natalie and Miriam would have really great input on this one. This question came up multiple times, actually. How do we determine the root cause of symptoms such as fatigue when you are both on a hormone therapy and recently completed either active treatment or a stage of treatment? So Miriam, maybe if you could kind of speak on the medicine, and Natalie, if you can speak on a little bit of your experience with communicating with your physicians.
Yes, so no, great question and such a common experience by many patients. It can be confusing. I think it's important to say that. I will talk about in generally the biological understanding of fatigue, typically with radiation or recent chemo. When we have measured markers of inflammation and markers related to fatigue, they do seem to persist for months after treatment has ended. So if I were to base it on that evidence, I would say more than likely it's still the effect of recent radiation and fatigue, sometimes for months after they have ended. However, I also like to tell my patients that your individual experience may not be what's in the textbook or a recent publication. So whether the addition of anti-estrogen therapy, those hormonal shifts, especially if you're younger and are on ovarian suppression, those can certainly impact things as well. So when it's confusing like that and it's really impacting your quality of life, certainly we try different strategies. Our strongest evidence for treatment-related fatigue, whether it's coming from chemo, radiation, or hormonal therapy, is actually regular physical activity. That's the strongest body of evidence for it. So trying that, seeing a specialist in onco rehab to kind of ease you into kind of different exercises for fatigue or something that I start with. If it's really not improving or impacting your quality of life, I do discuss the pros and cons of a temporary treatment hold with the current treatment, just to tease out what might be causing what. But I think from one of the chat questions, which was that I recently finished radiation and then I started anti-estrogen therapy, I think biologically, I would say the fatigue is most likely coming from radiation, and generally it will get better with time.
And I'll just add briefly, I did experience fatigue when I had radiation as well, and throughout other parts of the journey. I would say having a newborn, I didn't have a choice but to push through. And so I do think that sometimes the activity that Dr. Lusberg described could also be helpful, because it forces you to sort of push through it, but don't take on too much is what I would also recommend. And I also would say, when I mentioned that I was doing a lot of research on my diet, one of the things that she referenced was inflammation. And I actually did a lot on my own to figure out what holistic methods I could pursue outside of the advice of my oncologist to find foods that would be helpful with those issues. And so I started taking things like black seed oil, increasing the amount of veggies, and I started eating less meat. And those things, for me physically, I felt a physical change in my body when it came to fatigue.
Great, thank you so much. I think this question is more for Natalie, but as a young adult diagnosed with breast cancer, did you experience any challenges or unmet needs for your support in your journey?
I think there are definitely parts of the journey that you will feel no one can relate to. There are times when I felt that I was just sort of, even though I had like a really huge family support from my mom, from my husband, siblings, etc., there were definitely moments that I felt that no one knew what I was going through. And so it was actually those moments that challenged me to find other people who had similar experiences through social media, even in the actual, I call it the lab, but when I would go for treatment, I would actually interact intentionally with other people who were engaged in treatment, just to, share my experience, to see if other people had similar experiences, and sometimes talking with them helped me sort of get through those challenges.
Yes, and that question was submitted anonymously, but I would like to point out that Natalie was very kind and left her contact information directly in the chat. So if anyone wants to reach out to her, I'm sure she would be very interested. So I have a question. We've been talking about financial toxicities listed as a true health toxicity. Is there any conversation in the research community about delay of diagnosis? I heard Natalie's story. It sounded a lot like my own. I saw some comments in the chat, and I was wondering if there's anything going on in the research sphere on that.
Yes, so full disclosure, I'm not a financial toxicity expert, but I do see, of course, how much it impacts my patients. I believe there are data certainly out there that access to care due to lack of insurance coverage, access to different specialties can definitely delay diagnosis. The younger population is particularly vulnerable because often, you know, if you're very young, you may be on your parents' insurance, and then once that runs out, if you're kind of between jobs or haven't quite found that gap coverage, absolutely, I think these are some of the challenges in the AYA population, the young adult breast cancer population. And in addition to financial things, we also saw delays in diagnosis post-COVID, where when screenings were delayed, we're actually seeing much later presentation of breast cancer, unfortunately. So yeah, it's kind of what we call the social determinants of health, you know, how our environment and social situation directly impacts our health. And NIH is actually asking us to stop talking about financial toxicity as a descriptive thing. We keep talking about it. Yes, lots of financial burden, but now the imperative is let's look towards solutions. We know it's a problem, but we really need to design interventions. And so one recent small study that was published was, you know, how we have tumor boards for cancer. What if we had a financial tumor board, or sort of kind of incorporated that within our tumor board discussion, so we better understood our patients' out-of-pocket expenses. They could have insurance, but still have out-of-pocket expenses, as you all know. So I think we need to do a better job in terms of understanding kind of what the financial burdens our patients are experiencing. A lot of times oncologists are removed from it. We prescribe the drugs and not know what impact it's having.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat, more about neuropathy. So what can we do to help improve neuropathy that's slowly getting better, but it's extremely frustrating?
Yes. It's a gap. It's something that I study. So in terms of there have been over 50 studies or more looking at interventions for chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. And what's confusing about it is interventions that have been shown to work in other types of neuropathies actually don't necessarily work in chemotherapy-induced neuropathy, perhaps because it's a different mechanism. So if it's a painful neuropathy, our strongest data are with duloxetine or Cymbalta. It's been shown to reduce in a randomized phase 3 study that was published a few years back. It can reduce painful neuropathy, but doesn't do much for that numbness feeling, which is something that patients feel a lot. If you haven't officially had any physical therapy to work on balance and function, I strongly recommend that. I think that can be helpful. There are phase 2 data, not phase 3, that acupuncture may be helpful, but we're really waiting for phase 3 studies. Dr. Ting Bao and Memorial Sloan Kettering is currently doing a randomized phase 3 study looking at acupuncture for neuropathy. We don't have data for. So I think my strongest recommendation is if you're off the drug, great. I think being more physically active and exercise regimen and oncologic rehab could be something that's considered. And then potentially, if it's a more painful issue, consideration of duloxetine. Some of the drugs like gabapentin and things like that that work in other neuropathies have actually not been shown to be helpful in chemotherapy-induced neuropathy. However, patients can have individual experience of benefit.
And I don't have a medical answer, but if I could just briefly chime in on one part, I still experience neuropathy 7 years later. I don't find it to be as bad as it was. But there is one thing that I would just caution people to do, and this is something that I've sort of taken heed to as well. My feet and my hands can get extremely sore when they're exposed to cold. So cold water, cold temperatures. So just be proactive and protect yourself with the use of gloves and socks. And if you feel like your hands are burning from that feeling, don't be tempted to like run hot water over them. And I'm not the expert on this, but I have heard that like if you do suffer from frostbite and you don't know it, putting your hands under hot water could be detrimental. So it might sound silly to add this little fun fact, but just be mindful that you should probably just stick to regular gloves and socks to warm your hands and feet back up.
Great advice. Yes, and I see in the chat the scrambler therapy. Yes, Dr. Tom Smith is a wonderful. We do have phase 2 data on scrambler therapy compared to TENS unit therapy. So if that's available to you near you, I think if you're in the Baltimore region, certainly Hopkins has a good resource for that for sure. Thanks, Dr. Stern.
Thank you. Someone asked about today's slides. I'm not sure if you saw, but this is being recorded. I'm sure you heard the official blip, but it will be available on the website as well as recordings from previous webinars. So you can find that on the Breast Cancer Program website, and Dr. Stearns dropped the link in the chat.
So I think
12:59. So I think that's just perfect.
I'm just going to go back to our wrap up. Hopefully everybody can see, but just a big thank you to our presenters from today. And just to let you know, our sponsors for our Lunch and Learn series, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Jane Rice Survivorship Program in Breast Cancer. And a reminder, I know we've been through this before, but it's super important because we don't know what presentations to offer you next time if we don't hear from you what you think of this one and what other presentations you would like to hear. So as soon as you close out on this Zoom webinar, you're going to receive an invitation to complete a more formal evaluation. It's more than the 3 questions you already did, but it is still really quick, less than 5 minutes, and there's no personal information collected. If you're unable to do it immediately, that's totally understandable, but we will be bugging you one more time by email, and we're hoping you can do it within 7 days. Finally, I think we're right on 1 o'clock. A reminder of our next webinar that's part of our series. We will be hearing from Dr. Otis Brawley about overcoming health disparities in breast cancer, and that will be Thursday, October 28 in this lunch hour. So thanks so much to everybody for joining. Thank you for our speakers. Thank you, Natalie, for sharing your story, and Dr. Lusberg for your wonderful presentation, and to our entire organization committee and Sam for co-moderating with me. We look forward to having the next presentation. Have a good afternoon, everybody.